off with two stories. One story is during the pandemic, we were in lockdown and I was asked to assist a student with a capstone project. Now, all of this work began when I was still teaching at University of Puerto Rico back before I was 100. The student met me at the fort complex at Fort Charlotte, and we started an interview. There was a man waving frantically off to the side, and then he got really irate, and he came running up to say, "What the fuck are you doing? Why are you ignoring me?" The anger of blackness in colonial black space is very interesting. And I looked at him and I said, "We weren't ignoring you. We were discussing something." He said, "But you can't discuss that in front of this space." And I said, "Okay." So I said, "We'll speak to her because she's the person in charge of the interview. Did you get permission?" No. "Why didn't you get permission? Did you write to the ministry?" No. "This is a private space, you gotta leave." So we left. We crossed the road and we did the interview there. What had transpired, to follow up with Keisha's point, is you have cultural loss that is not documented at all or discussed in any meaningful way in the Bahamian public sphere. Second story, growing up on Harbour Island. Harbour Island is a tiny island just off the coast of Eleuthera because we had a very small boat, if it could be called that, as a kid. You know, people see boats now and they think, "Oh yeah, those are boats." No, those are not boats. We grew up on boats, and the boats, you had to keep bailing out water because it was very rustic. So growing up in Harbour Island, all these old buildings were a part of our lives. And suddenly in the 90s, there was this amazing realization that these were important parts of history. And just as suddenly as that happened, they started to get knocked down. As they were protected, the bulldozer came in overnight and removed one on Bay Street, or Front Street. There was very little to be said. The protected building was gone. So there we have the Bahamas. In Puerto Rico, where I lived until I moved back here, there was a huge debate about el Paseo Caribe. Entonces, I was there, I was at the University of Puerto Rico teaching after having been a student, and we protested for what seemed like years. Of course, the gobierno decided that to hell with you people, we're just going to do what we're going to do, because what was happening was the US Armed Forces was returning land to Puerto Rico, which meant that a small group of very wealthy, very influential people took this land and basically confiscated it from the state. The state is a very dangerous tool. Keisha didn't say that. So what we're finding here is Fort San Jeronimo was then effectively privatized as a part of it, Paseo Caribe. And people were pissed off, but what can you do when the state comes out against you? I mean, believe me, in Puerto Rico, people were pissed off. And there was a great deal of activism. Why is this important? What we have here is an archipelago of people who are so far removed from many of their historical sites that they don't even understand they exist. So, okay, this is interesting. The story I started off with the capstone student was really disturbing for me because of the violence of the security guard visited on this young woman. And me, because he saw me as threatening his authority. But that then just spoke to how the government was using a very interesting, very troubling moment to effectively remove historical sites from the commons. Has anyone said anything much about it? No. So it then took on a whole new trajectory when, under the former government, they opted to put all historical sites into a trust of sorts, which was actually a private company, and they were going to control them that way. Of course, it didn't happen because somebody caught wind of it, but it doesn't mean it's not happening. It didn't happen, but it doesn't mean it's not ongoing. And that's something I've learned from Puerto Rico. El proceso of decolonization has been weak or non-existent. In Puerto Rico, people, my students at the University of Puerto Rico were really engaged in understanding where they lived in space and how they inhabited that space. When I came here to the college then, I had a student who said to me, you know, oh, Clifton Pier, that's so far, that doesn't matter to me. And if you know anything about Clifton Pier, that's the Clifton Heritage Site, and it really does matter, but because there's so little knowledge of space and place in the Bahamas, educated into Bahamians, it is troubling that we are so able to lose things, or so happy to lose things. And happy is a really interesting word. My Barbadian friend uses it. She said, "You're too happy." And there's so many connotations there. So loss in the Bahamas, I always equate nowadays to economic gain. So what we are losing, we are told we are making up for with jobs. My student, and here I'm also stepping on toes, was mortified because, of course, she had never tried anything like this before. So what we had done was effectively slapped her back into her corner. So here we have, again, no access. So how do we decolonize space? Well, our idea of decolonizing space in this post-colony is to sell it to China and erect a hotel called The Point on what was Fort Nassau, without any real public debate about that. I know Grace Turner has done work around cemeteries, and it also is interesting that we can give away a whole cemetery because it has a bunch of black people laying dead in it, and there be absolutely no awareness that these bodies were buried here except for the work that Turner has done. I find that astonishing because I grew up in a period that I guess before independence, through independence, and there was so much awareness, and that awareness has been slowly eroded by changing space. When you remap space, you basically disorientate an entire population. So with the island archipelago and everybody coming to New Providence to live because this is where you can make money, there's a great deal of, I want to call it structural coloniality, which actually translates into structural violence using Johann Galtung's concept of structural and then cultural violence. So when we talk about the museum, what is a museum? Fort Nassau was surely a part of a museum, but that museum, even after the legislation was enacted, was erased. Or, well, it should be somewhere out there behind what is now Fortress China. So the fortification of spaces has changed our entire relationship with the way we inhabit place. So if we no longer see ourselves in place, we no longer have a relationship with ourselves, with our community, and with our dead. This is another point where my book looks at the development of a small community on one of the southern islands in the Bahamas. The company came in, had an agreement with government, and they were going to be given land at, I think it was $1 an acre. No Bahamian can have that kind of access to land. So the company then was given almost the entire settlement, and they were given the graveyard. The company folded, and we don't know what happened after that. So the land effectively was taken away from the people and given to this company. I'm not going to call the name. I could, but it repeats itself time and again. And it continues. Just in Abaco this year, I think it was 2 days ago on the television, there was another announcement of the groundbreaking of Sterling Investment Corporation, I am calling that name, for the creation of a high-end gated hotel, boutique, something development where I think plots started at $6 million. I thought, okay. Now Sterling owns a whole other complex on Paradise Island that instead of being like Marina Village, which built around the marina so you wouldn't notice that you were fenced out, Sterling put up a fence to make it obvious that you were not welcome unless you went through security. To working class black bodies, this is a huge challenge because that space had some signification prior to that fence going up. There was a lot more access. But what does access mean when your education does not talk about that? When your education does not bring awareness to your relationship with history, it doesn't bother to decolonize history, and I hope Chris is in here, in a way that is a constructive to the formation of a local and thriving identity. So the coloniality of the Bahamas is illustrated in the way that the laws are written. We often give access to international investors or foreign developers over access to Bahamians. So the Point was a prime example of that. The first example of that was the Clifton Key development that was promised in 1996, I think it was. I was here during my PhD period, and I went to one of the first town hall meetings, and people were livid because it would have effectively removed the western tip of New Providence and put it into a private body's hands, and that would have been Clifton Heritage Site. So the government said, well, you know, they will protect it, they will look after it, and they will give you access maybe once a month, which is great if you want to have that kind of relationship with your history. The violence inherent in that is never discussed. So those are my 3 points. Space as a deeply colonized space, the formation of which has not been challenged. If you are Bahamian, you don't understand how important space is to your identity because it is segmented into tourism zone, which goes back to the Fanonian understanding of spatial relations, and which would have been the settler zone, and the native quarter. And the native quarter is this dangerous place that you don't want to go to, but it's full of culture. So the book that we're working on now is all about understanding Over the Hill, and how Over the Hill really is a microcosm of everything that's happening in the Bahamas. So while we have the deracination of the Bahamian population through structural and coloniality and violence, we also have systemic racism that operates in very interesting ways in a black country. Your blackness can disempower you in the same way that the legislation segregates you and disempowers you. So I want to keep it short, and that is where loss and economic gain seem to really be equal to each other. And what happens within that is that we lose the museums. Now, I know it's weird. I am right now the director of the National Art Gallery. I don't know how long it'll last after my book is published, but because the thing is, if you don't interrogate these problems, they just get worse. And they are getting worse. So one of the things that we have to think about, and as a young woman, Keisha could probably help me with that, is how young women feel within a space that completely erases them, that completely defaces them and reduces them, well, reduces all of us really to black bodies that are exoticized, as Shani was talking about last night. So that decoloniality of the conversation hasn't happened. And space, as I was told when I went to find information for the book at the Bahamian archives, and the Bahamian land registry. Land and surveys that they call the land registry. It took me 3 days to actually get the map that I needed, but it didn't exist. And I was told categorically that this map didn't exist. But what it showed was how powerfully the land had been divided in the colonial past and remained owned by those same colonial folks. But that conversation, again, is absent from most of the conversations we have in the facilities of education. So how then do we as museum people create spaces where there can be a real vibrant, thriving, robust exchange of ideas and information and access that to people who, in other words, don't have access? And I think we have to be a little bit more honest about who has access and who doesn't. And it's not to hit out at the NAGB or any of the institutions, but it is to understand that government has done very little to break down those barriers to the coloniality of space. I thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. That's an interesting topic, and we need more than 20 minutes to talk about it. Definitively. If someone have a question, feel free.
Yes, I have a question. Or more like I'm going to sound out my feelings, and hopefully you can talk to me about it. I'm curious as to what you say. What are some of the factors that are affecting race in that whole issue with the government? Right, I think from my perspective in Florida, the things that you're talking about, decolonizing history, are things that are politically very sensitive and arguably on the road to being illegal, right? So where are the spaces where this is happening, and what's the pushback from the Bahamian perspective about decolonizing history? I think what I gathered is that there's an economic benefit to not acknowledging that history. The United States has its own rationale, right? Or at least in Florida and in Miami specifically. So could you expand on why else do you think, from your perspective, political entities or political structures are hesitant or obtuse about, as you say, rightly say, decolonizing history?
Columbus stood at the top of George Street until he was named by the Archangel Michael. So he was only taken down again and put somewhere that we don't know where he is. But the decolonization of that statue was never allowed because he was a tourist attraction, right? So Christchurch Cathedral, for me, is another interesting part of that whole colonial paradigm. Even though we are deeply, deeply religious, it's still a part of the colonial paradigm that we have not even begun to challenge, or the segregation of space that exists in the Bahamas but has been invisibilized by urbanization and the movement or the depopulation of the over-the-hill area, but the replacement with more migrant populations. at the same time, the point has just proliferated. And the point, if you really look at it, sits down at the bottom of Bay Street, which was a really thriving port. Bay Street is no longer a thriving port because it's been moved into, I guess, RCI? Sorry. That was another sale that we didn't get information about. So it's been privatized. The port of Nassau has been privatized under a consortium that is interestingly formulated by the former colonial benefactors or beneficiaries and the group from England. Nothing to do with colonialism at all. And of course, there are a few players who benefit by giving away this land, but the land was always already owned by those colonial powers that have been allowed to continue, because when the political independence came in 1973, there was absolutely no change in the economic model. So there was no economic decolonization. Educational decolonization may have happened when I was in primary school for a brief instant, but I went to a very interesting primary and then high school, and let me tell you, if you went to that school, you were separated from the rest of the class. You were. So my cousin, and I bring the whole family here, Gail Saunders, went to QC. She was the first student of color. And to be told that you should not speak to the boys on the other side of the fence because they were Kemp Road boys and black should give you some indication of why the dynamics have remained unchanged. Because also, there are a few embassies in town that really benefit from keeping things the way they are. And we have a particular relationship that we do not wish to compromise. Como in Puerto Rico, the United States has a really important part to play in the economic development of the colonies or the post-colonies, that with the land which was owned by Britain as bases was ceded to the US around the same time that independence was beginning to take root. So I hope I've answered your question. Like, a lot of the land that is being developed now, as we develop it, we are actually losing markers of what had happened before. And I know this doesn't make sense because we are holding on to the past, but it's actually really important to understand what went there, where the Burma Road riots were, how the Burma Road riots happened, and why they didn't change anything really. Because Bahamians still get paid less than expats for doing the same job. So the coloniality of space is huge. Sorry, did I get your question?
I appreciate the context.